Oh, we've lost your PowerPoint, Brian.
Yep. Just give me a second.
Oh, sorry.
All right. Is it back?
It is indeed, yes.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming today, and especially to Fergal and Alumni Affairs for organizing this event. I really appreciate you taking your lunch hour to talk about what might seem to be an unappetizing topic, zombies. One of the things that the humanities, and I think in particular philosophy, has really struggled with is how to make what we do more accessible and more relevant, not only to students, but also to the broader public. But meeting this challenge, I think, is really important if those in the humanities want to combat the narrative that what we do is impenetrable and irrelevant to the lives of ordinary people. And this increasingly popular narrative, I think, has implications for everything from federal and state funding for education to the individual decisions that students make when choosing courses. In popularizing philosophy, though, there's a real delicate balance that has to be struck between making the material accessible without losing or watering down the philosophical message. And what I'm going to do today is first talk about some of the approaches that others have used in trying to popularize philosophy, at least in the literary world, so that we can talk about other examples in the Q&A, and then provide an overview of the new approach that my book offers. So the philosophy and pop culture anthology is definitely the most common way of trying to reach a broader audience. Both Blackwell and Open Court have philosophy and pop culture series, and between them, they've got 150 anthologies of philosophical essays on pop cultural themes. I think the big problem with these, notwithstanding their merits, is that they typically don't adopt the genre conventions of the pop culture that they're incorporating. And they also use a real traditional mode of philosophical presentation, the argumentative essay, which I think really limits its appeal to non-philosophers, including students. And for any of you, and most of you are alums, so who have taken a philosophy class here at Regis, you know how difficult it can be to get used to that style of philosophical writing. So I think part of it is trying to find a way of modifying that style so that it's more accessible. But certainly in most of these pop culture and philosophy anthologies, the message is much, much more important than the degree to which that message is accessible. Another approach, which kind of goes in the completely other direction, is philosophical fiction. And even if the fiction is itself accessible, it can obscure the philosophical content. And some of the philosophical fiction that's out there even separates the philosophy completely from the fiction, which really doesn't help in making the former any more accessible. So I think this is a good example of where the accessibility turns out to be much more important than the philosophical message itself. And the book that's pictured here, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, is a book by Rebecca Goldstein. And I think it's really the limiting case where the fictional context really overwhelms any philosophical content. So the philosophical references in her fiction are really intended as Easter eggs, which require the reader to already be familiar with the philosophy in question. In other words, the fiction doesn't really explain or illuminate the philosophy. And in her case, the actual philosophy, the 36 arguments, are left in an appendix at the end of the book. And these are just bare bone propositional logic argument reconstructions, which certainly isn't going to help you to understand the arguments in question. But there are some other approaches, I think, that strike a little better balance. So some of you may have read Wittgenstein's Poker or Rousseau's Dog or Would You Kill the Fat Man? These are all books that were written by David Edmonds and John Idenau, who are journalists. And they're a really great mix, I think, of journalism, intellectual history, and humor. They're much, much more engaging for a non-philosophical audience than a traditional philosophical essay. And they have more philosophical content than straight philosophical fiction, but they still don't really delve deep enough into the philosophical issues to be assigned in a philosophy course. Another approach, though, one that I think is quite strong, is when folks use the novel in order to systematically present philosophical ideas. And perhaps the best example of this is Jostein Gaarde's book, Sophie's World, which came out, I think, in the early 1990s. It doesn't break the fourth wall. In other words, it remains thoroughly ensconced in its fictional setting. And it's actually one of the books that got me interested in philosophy when I was in high school. And I think in this case, you see the message really being held equivalent to the accessibility of that message. And there's some other books that I think are kind of along these same lines. There's Harry Frankfurt's On Bullshit, which was published by Princeton in 2005, that takes a popular theme, bullshitting, and creates a philosophical theory to explain it. There's Nadler and Nadler, so it's Steve Nadler and his son. His son's a graphic artist, and Steve Nadler is a famous historian of modern philosophy. And they wrote a book, Heretics, The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, which was published by Princeton in 2017. And it uses the graphic novel as a way of presenting the history of philosophy. And I think that's a really nice and accessible way of doing it. And these books, I think, do delve deeply and carefully enough into the philosophical content to be fruitful secondary sources in a philosophy course, but I would say they're more the exception than the rule. My recent book adopts a new approach to popularizing philosophical content such that it still has a useful pedagogical function. And the idea here is to popularize the philosophy again, making it very accessible while not losing fidelity to the philosophical content, so not compromising the philosophical message itself. And as a mashup, what it does is it combines two works that have certain structural similarities to one another to create something new that's not reducible to either of these things that have been combined with one another. And so this is kind of the structure of the mashup in my book. And I think the fundamental structural similarity is that both the standard philosophical primer, especially an introduction to ethics primer, and a zombie survival guide, like the one that Max Brooks wrote, both move from a very general treatment of the subject matter in question to the very specific, where those specific claims presuppose that one has already granted the more general claims. And so just to move down these triangles, at the level of meta-ethics, or the nature of zombies, there's a general discussion of the fundamental questions concerning the phenomenon under discussion. Are there objective moral values? What is a zombie? And specific answers to these questions are really assumed for everything that follows, either in an introduction to ethics text or in a zombie survival guide. At the next level, the level of ethical theory, or the tactics for surviving, these theories or tactics are presented and their limitations are exposed. And then finally, there's applied ethics, or the field reports in a zombie survival guide that examine how these theories or tactics can be applied in concrete cases, also exposing in a practical sense the limitations of those theories in concrete scenarios. And in my book, the continuous cycle of short stories, graphic art, and prose is borrowed from that zombie survival guide. And it's something that I think really helps to keep the reader engaged throughout the book. So even if you get a little bit bored as you're going through the philosophical prose, you might be looking forward to the next short story and seeing what the graphic art is. So here's some of the features of my book. Like the Gardner book, Sophie's World, it stays firmly ensconced in its fictional setting. It incorporates all and only the basic content of an ethics primer, which ensures that the philosophical message isn't going to be compromised. It also incorporates zombie horror genre conventions to ensure that the book is accessible to a broad audience. So the aim here is to draw in potential readers from an existing popular subgenre by maintaining the conventions of that genre. And just to draw a quick contrast, another pretty famous academic zombie book was written by Daniel Dresner, who's a political scientist over at Tufts University. You might have also seen his monthly Washington Post op-ed that he writes. But he wrote a book, again published with Princeton a few years ago, called Theories of International Politics and Zombies. and it uses zombies, but it doesn't incorporate those zombie horror conventions, and it doesn't write, and the prose isn't behind the fourth wall. So even though zombies are kind of used as an illustration, or post-apocalyptic scenarios are used as a way of illustrating and explaining and exposing the limitations of different theories of international politics, it still doesn't incorporate those genre conventions that I think really help to keep the reader more engaged. If one would like an analogy, the way that I usually try to put it to people is that my book is kind of like the cheese that you would put on broccoli when you want a child to eat broccoli. And any of you who have children have probably had an experience somewhat like this. The thing that you want them to eat, you mask behind something that they do in fact want to eat. And I think the other important thing here is that you don't only want the child to eat the broccoli, but you want the child to want to eat the broccoli, and that's the function of the cheese. And so, the broccoli and the cheese in this metaphor is very much like the philosophy and the zombies, where the zombies are the cheese that makes the philosophy more digestible for someone who might otherwise not be inclined to pick up a philosophy book. And by the way, up here on this slide is a good example of some of the interior artwork that was done by an undergraduate illustration major. So here's the title of the book and a shot of the front cover. The point within the context of the book is to convince others that moral reasoning is still valuable in a world from which it seems almost entirely absent. Survivors recognize that the greatest thing that they have to fear from the apocalypse is not the zombies, but themselves. When not murdered by others or robbed and left to die, survivors in post-apocalyptic horror too often suffer complete psychological breakdowns, or they take their own lives. All of the philosophical content in the book is presented behind this fourth wall, using genre conventions. So for example, the ethical theories are used as ways of navigating the zombie apocalypse from an ethical point of view. The book employs regular graphic art, short horror stories or field exercises that help to illustrate the philosophical ideas that are being discussed in that chapter. And so just to give an example, when it comes to applied ethics, instead of talking about our obligations to the poor, for example, using examples of global poverty, like Peter Singer does in his famous essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, that you might have had to read in an Introduction to Ethics course here at Regis, I instead focus on the obligations of strongholds to survivors who are seeking sanctuary from the throngs of the undead. So it's very much a parallel situation, but it makes it less abstract, it makes it more concrete, it allows the reader to envision themselves in that situation, what they would say, the kinds of decisions that they might make. And the book was published earlier this year by Bloomsbury. So just to give an overview of the structure of each of the chapters, each chapter begins with an epigraph that takes a classic philosophical quotation relevant to the content of that chapter and zombifies it to the post-apocalyptic context. So for example, when discussing virtue ethics, I modify Aristotle's famous saying about how, quote, one swallow does not make the spring, neither does one fine day. Similarly, one day or brief period of happiness does not make a man blessed and happy, unquote. So probably the most famous passage from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And in my book, I modify it to read, quote, one zombie does not make the apocalypse, neither does one vicious day, nor similarly does one day or a brief space of cruelty make a man cursed and unhappy, unquote. And the idea here is that the cultivation either of a virtuous or happy character or a vicious/unhappy character requires habitual action over time. It's not just one action or one instance that transforms you into a virtuous or a vicious individual. It's a series of actions over time. After the after the epigraph is a piece of graphic art, like what you see above, that's meant to reflect in some way the content of the field exercise or short story that illustrates a philosophical position. The short stories connect with one another, ultimately to create an overarching dramatic narrative and it's one that tracks the post-apocalyptic life of the author of the book and how their character is slowly compromised through the choices that they make in order to survive. The author, who's a philosophy professor, knows what they ought to have done to retain a virtuous character, but they lack the strength of will, what the ancient Greeks called akrasia, to do what morality requires. So a person knows what they ought to do, but they fail to have the strength of will to do what they know that they ought to do. And that ultimately ends up cultivating a fairly vicious character by the end of the book. The philosophical prose that follows each of the short stories is broken into sections that reflect what you would see in a philosophical primer. But the content is written behind the fictional fourth wall and uses the short story to explain the philosophical concepts. And so really in the philosophical prose section of every chapter, you're going to get everything that you would normally get in an introduction to ethics primer. The difference is that you have this fictional story that's being drawn from to illustrate the content of what's being discussed, and that the content of the philosophical prose never breaks the fourth wall. And so it's all being written from the perspective of someone trying to survive a zombie apocalypse, and all of the examples and illustrations that are given are from that post-apocalyptic world. At the end of the chapter is a one-paragraph summary of the content, and this is followed by a further study section that lists other philosophical works that discuss the content from that chapter, as well as other zombie sources. So books, comics, movies, TV shows that touch on the philosophical themes from that chapter. And one of the conceits of the book is that the manuscript is actually found footage, kind of Blair Witch Project style. So the book was written and it was left in a location, and then after the apocalypse is over, it's discovered and it's taken to an archive, and the curator of that archive is the one that's adding the further study section, and there's a preface that's added by this individual as well. But all of this is intended to kind of maintain that, helping people to suspend their disbelief while reading the book, and to not break the fourth wall. There's a couple of different ways that I've applied the book so far. So I did use a draft of the book before it was published in an Introduction to Ethics course that I taught at St. John's University before coming to Regis. So once I arrived at Regis, I'm a dean now, and so they fear for letting me in the classroom, so I actually haven't had a chance to use the book in class here at Regis, but I had a really successful experience in the course that I taught at St. John's University. And there were a lot of things that I ended up doing differently simply by virtue of the way in which the philosophical content was being framed. So we did small group role-playing out of the state of nature to understand the contractarian view of ethics. And so this is the view that morality is founded upon a social contract between individuals for the mutual satisfaction of their preferences. We did team role-playing also to deal with issues in applied ethics. So for example, to go back to that stronghold example, where you have two different teams that are both inside of a stronghold with limited resources, and they have to use opposing ethical views to argue either for or against letting at-risk survivors into the stronghold, where the class then votes on what to do. Students still had the option to write a standard philosophical essay, so the kind of thing that you would see in one of these philosophy and pop culture anthologies, but I did my best to encourage students to be creative in the way they examined philosophical concepts. And most students chose to write short stories or even plays in some instances where they acted these out in class to construct and critically evaluate a philosophical argument. So I think one of the big learning experiences for me as a faculty member is just how flexible we can be with the mode of presentation that students use to present and evaluate philosophical arguments. We don't need to expect them to reconstruct these in propositional form or in the context of an essay form. There's lots of other forms that students feel a lot more affinity for and allows them to meet the learning outcomes just as well, if not better. And then finally, we used pop cultural content referred to in the further study sections of the book So for example, episodes of The Walking Dead, to help make the philosophical content more accessible and relevant to the overarching theme of the course. And so it was really nice just having the zombies and that kind of post-apocalyptic world that could serve as this kind of guiding thread throughout the entire semester in order to make the philosophical material more accessible. I've also had the pleasure of doing some public philosophy over the past several months. And the really great thing I think about going out to bookstores and Comic-Cons has been reaching an audience that otherwise wouldn't engage with philosophy at this depth at all. And I think it's really important, though, as I mentioned at the outset, that non-philosophers and non-philosophy students have the opportunity to engage with philosophical ideas in a way that's accessible to them without compromising the philosophical content, so that the engagement has the opportunity to really be transformative for them. You know, and as any of you know who went to school here at Regis, a big function of the philosophy and the religious studies courses that we teach is to be transformative in just this way. But we need to pitch things at a level and in a way that allows for that opportunity for transformation. And sometimes the standard philosophical essay or presenting philosophical ideas simply in their original context without trying to make them more accessible forecloses, I think, the opportunity for transformation for a lot of students as well as people beyond the walls of Regis. And the crowds of non-philosophers that have been showing up to these events, I think, really demonstrate that there's a desire for this kind of work. And even if people are coming for the cheese, the zombies, they end up staying for the broccoli or the philosophy without being worse for wear. So thanks a lot for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes, Fergal.
Hi, Brian. I'm going to reclaim host back if that's okay. So you can just focus
Sure.
on answering questions if you can pass me over to the hosting duties. But we actually received some questions on the submission form if you'd like to go through them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let me just call them up here. The first one was, what is ethics to begin with? Like, how would you explain ethics to someone who has never heard the phrase before?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the study of our individual obligations to one another. It's the study of what we ought to do. And so, you know, and it stands in contrast to the ways in which folks actually do treat one another. So just because we do treat one another in certain ways, just because we're greedy or cruel or mean or, you know, various other things, terrible ways that we might treat one another, there's a question of whether this ought to be the way that we treat one another, and is does not imply ought. And so ethics is really the study of the ought as applied to individuals.
Okay. And the other one was, in the face of I love this question, in the face of an impending apocalypse, how does one logically and compassionately engage with the inevitable deniers that a situation even exists?
Sure. Yeah, and I touch on that a little bit in the book. So we have a character that might remind someone of a current political leader who's kind of denying this phenomenon, and if it exists, blaming it on others who are outside of the country. And in the book, he gets devoured on stage. And so that kind of puts an end to any speculation as to whether this is real or not. You know, and I think that that's, you know, one of the things that's helpful in, you know, post-apocalyptic fiction or, you know, zombie literature in particular is there's kind of no doubting within that frame of reference that what's going on is actually going on. You know, I would say that much the same thing is true for COVID-19. You know, but a virus that you know makes you sick and can potentially put you on a respirator or even kill you, perhaps is not as viscerally engaging as having a zombie just bite into your leg.
And sort of almost moving past that into the more, when the apocalypse is more probably established, how do you stop seeing everyone as a potential threat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the themes that comes across generally in post-apocalyptic fiction, and it's certainly something that shows up a lot in my book, is, how do we trust one another in the absence of a civil society that might enforce those standards of trust and punish people for violating one another's trust? And that's a big question. It's a difficult question to answer. Certainly for folks like Thomas Hobbes or the contractarians that I was talking about before, in the absence of civil society that enforces the law, there is no such thing as morality. Hobbes's famous saying from Leviathan is, "Covenants without the sword have no value, and cannot protect anyone at all." And so for him, an agreement or a covenant without enforcement, or the sword where the Commonwealth holds that sword, you're simply not going to have morality. Now there's others, someone like Immanuel Kant, or even John Stuart Mill, I would say, and certainly Aristotle, I would say that this is really a matter of individuals, and it has to do with using reason, cultivating the right kind of character, and to do that, you have to trust others, even if it's going to put you at risk. And so, I think what someone like Aristotle would say is that, if what we do to survive ends up compromising us so fundamentally that we're morally no different than the zombies that we're trying to escape, much better it is to be a zombie than to be a human being, because the human being who's cultivated this kind of vicious character is morally responsible for what they've done in the way that the zombie isn't. And so I think, someone like Aristotle would respond that, hey, look, friendship is absolutely vital to what it is to be a human being, and friendship requires trust. And if you don't have friends, you're not going to be able to cultivate virtue, and you're ultimately not going to be a happy individual. You will be unhappy, alone, and vicious, and no one wants to be in that position.
So would anyone else like to ask a question? If you can raise your hand or enter it into the group chat, I'm sure Bryan would be more than happy to take anything that you'd like to throw his way. Bryan, just on a quick note, do zombies run?
Well, there's multiple kinds of zombies within the context of the book, Virgil, so interesting that you should ask that. There's basically three kinds that I talk about in the book. So there are the running zombies, which are basically living humans that are infected but non-rational. So if you've seen a movie like 28 Days Later, for example, that would be a good illustration of this kind of zombie. So it's a living human being, but is non-rational. And I like to use that kind of zombie because it allows us to talk about issues in animal ethics, where we're talking about living organisms that are non-rational in most cases. There's also what I call the moaners, which are kind of your George Romero, Night of the Living Dead style zombie, where they're undead and they shamble around. And I use this as kind of a limiting case as well, to ask the question, is a moaner morally considerable or not? And I think that this question becomes more interesting within the context of the book, because just like how Romero's zombies evolve over time, and so if you watch something like Night of the Living Dead, and then you watch one of the later movies like Land of the Dead, you see that the zombies have acquired rationality and sociability by those later films. And so the last kind of zombie in the book is a talker. And so it's an undead version of a human being who is rational, but also has an insatiable desire for flesh. And so we also have to ask the question, when it comes to those individuals who aren't responsible for the way that they feel, whether they're nonetheless morally considerable in the way that rational humans might be.
Thank you for that. Erica, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Fergal, and thank you very much, Bryan, for such an interesting overview of your book. As somebody who's eating lunch right now, I particularly appreciate that it didn't get too gross, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yes, yes. Now, I'm interested, as you were writing about the zombie apocalypse or sort of post-apocalyptic world, did you find that any of the ethical theories you were dealing with had limitations, and what were they? What did you come across?
Well, what I tried to do is, again, to adopt the structure and form of an introduction to ethics primer. And so for any ethical theory that you might be discussing, so, contractarianism, Kantian style duty-based ethics, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, ethics of care, so feminist ethics. In each of these cases, if you're reading the literature, there are certain strengths and weaknesses to each one. And so in the chapters where I am presenting each of those theories individually, I also try to use the fictional scenario in order to demonstrate what some of the philosophical limitations are of the theory. So, for example, there's a chapter where I'm talking about Kantian duty-based ethics, and Kant thought that you have certain perfect duties. So these are duties that admit of no exception whatsoever for inclination. And there are a couple that he mentions in particular. One has an absolute duty to preserve one's own life, that is to not commit suicide. One also has a duty not to lie, so to always tell the truth. And so there's this story that I use of a couple where the husband has promised the wife that I will always protect you, that you don't need to be worried, we're going to protect you from the zombie apocalypse. He ends up getting infected, and really the only way that he can keep his promise is by committing suicide. And so, I use that as a way of, illustrating the limitation that Kant's view faces. And then at the end of the book, I adopt what's called a pluralist view. So I say, you really have to bring various components of these ethical theories together if you hope to overcome the objections and limitations that each of them faces individually. Any other questions from anybody?
Sorry, I think we had one hand up there, but it disappeared. Oh, sorry, Eileen, yes, please go ahead.
Hi, Bryan. Thank you for sharing this today. I was, when I was reading the book, I was just thinking it might need to be remarketed for a pandemic situation because so much of it seemed to track with what's going on. But yeah. One of the maybe questions or comments was, in taking this, let's say I'm teaching with this text, taking it online, I was wondering if it might be possible if you had considered a simulation that students could walk through in application with the text.
Yeah, actually we have had some conversations about that. I think that it's probably something that would need to be done in an individual course rather than, for example, changing our ethics course that we offer in the school. Since it's expected that so many different people teach a version of that same course. But I think it's a great idea. And I think that, getting back to, something that the two of us have talked about, gamification, that, using a text like this within the context of a gamified course could be really successful and could go a long way towards improving online engagement. And I think it would be fairly easy to kind of recontextualize each of the short stories as kind of a choose your own adventure role playing, where, students can work through either, using a fully kind of multiplayer online, gamified environment, or even using things like discussion forums where students have to role play various positions that are being talked about within the context of the short stories, and have to justify what they're doing in terms of the ethical theories that they're learning. So, just like I was able to use kind of live action role playing within the context of the Intro to Ethics course that I taught at St. John's, I think that it would be, it might be a struggle technically to do it, but I think it could be, really effective if we were able to translate that into the online environment. Any other questions from anyone?
Hi, Erica, you're live again.
Okay, thanks, Virgil. So I have actually several more questions related to the philosophy, but I will spare everyone and just ask you those myself. Questions I think that more people might be interested in. So I have two in particular. I'll ask them both and then just mute myself again. So first, do you identify with the main character? And if so, how, where, and then where do you depart from him? And then second question is, do you have a favorite part of the book yourself? Now that seems and is a sort of simple, simplistic question, but having just written one myself, I actually could say, yes, I do have some favorite parts of my own. So I'd love to hear what yours are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's hard to write a book like this without identifying with any number of components of it. And there's, a number of examples that I use that are drawn from, my own life. Do I suffer from acrasia to the extent that the author and narrator of the book does? I hope not, but human beings are capable of infinite amounts of self-deception, so one can never be certain. Where it comes to, departing from it, or I'm sorry, where I think that the part that I like the most, I mean, the first story that I wrote was the one about the couple, and I think that that's kind of the touchstone for the entire book. And chronologically, it's the first story. So if you were to reconstruct the entire fictional narrative using the map that's at the beginning, that story that takes place at the home is the first one that happens, and the decisions that are made there, are the first step down this long path that leads this individual to become a very different person over time. So, I think that that's probably the one that I like the most, and probably was the one that was kind of least derivative in a lot of ways of other zombie apocalyptic fiction. A lot of the other stories are kind of derivative, or they're kind of contrived in certain ways. So there's like the prisoner's dilemma story, where you've got two people that are both holding doors that are keeping zombies at bay, and if one of them lets go, then the other one dies, and vice versa. And so you're put into this kind of prisoner's dilemma scenario. And that's one that I just created to try to provide an illustration of the prisoner's dilemma. So I think definitely the one about the couple is the one that has the most heart, probably. So the ways in which the narrator, the author of the book, departs from me, probably in philosophical comportment a little bit as well. I think that there's, from what I've heard from people, there's a kind of Kantianism that pervades the book that I didn't intend, and I certainly didn't want that to be the perspective of the author or narrator of the book, but it kind of shone through nonetheless. So that's probably an area where I'm shining through a little bit more than I intended the actual fictional author of the book to shine through. Any other questions from anybody? All right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bryan. Really appreciate that. And thank you for everybody for attending. This will be uploaded to the University Alumni YouTube channel if you would like to share it with anybody that may have missed it, or if anyone that would be interested in this. You'll be receiving a short survey in your email box, basically asking, On a scale of 1 to 5, how did you enjoy it, and any ideas for future webinars? We're always looking for volunteers if anyone would like to host their own webinar. Erica, I'm thinking of you, thank you. So thank you very much for attending, everybody. Any final thoughts, Bryan? Anything you'd like to add? Maybe how best to survive it if it happens with COVID-19, because it's 2020 and heaven knows what will happen by the end of the year.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of thing that I talked about in the book, you know, at the end remains true today, which is that, you know, we need to act in certain ways that are going to cultivate our culture, our characters in the right kinds of ways. So, you know, acting in ways that cultivate virtue rather than cultivate vice. You know, thinking really carefully about the impacts of our decisions on others and how those might ultimately affect us and the kinds of people that we turn out to be. You know, and that's something that we have to constantly be aware of, because our character is the thing for which we're ultimately most morally responsible in addition to our actions. So I guess that would be my parting advice. But thanks so much to everyone for joining today and for taking an hour of your day. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Bryan. Everybody have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.